Right. Okay, started recording. Okay, right. So I think, does everybody know each other? Or do we have to, should we go through the bit again, or where everyone says who they are? Okay, we've got a couple of people who weren't here last time, couldn't make it. I'm sure probably most of you know who they are anyway, but we'll help go around the room.
I want to be more.
Okay, and I'm Dennis. I'm your teacher for this weekend, as I was for the last weekend, and will be for the revision weekend. Now, today we move on to the second half of the study guide. We're going to do it in a slightly different order because we have Liz here for today and possibly for the second half of tomorrow. But given that she actually works in policy and resources and she works in the law offices, she's actually the ideal person to be an adjunct for the essentially the pure Guernsey side of it, the pure Guernsey constitution. How does the government of Guernsey work? Because of course this is an area which, when you come from the outside, it's possible to make lots of wrong assumptions, and also that there's something that they say in history, that if you try and piece together something from the outside, reading the documents, you generally won't understand it as much as somebody who's actually in the inside, just gathers from just being there. So I think it's invaluable for her to step in whenever I get my my committee names wrong, as they are occasionally wrong in the study guide, because all the study notes which were used to help write it actually had old language in and talked about the policy committee and not the policy and resources committee, and the policy council rather, not the policy and resources committee, or if I get it the right way around. So things have changed and things are changing now. We have two. So we have two adjuncts. Well, that's even better. So are you okay? But I think this can't do tomorrow morning. Very interesting. So tomorrow morning, I'm probably going to try and do the relationship, which is probably, you know, the more interesting sort of theoretical part of it. No. Well, hopefully that's the last of the organisational disasters for the day. Which no, I managed to not tell my wife that our daughter had to be somewhere at 9 rather than 10, so that was quite a disaster. I did organise the Elf on the Shelf properly, so that's something. Now, States of Guernsey and introduction. So this is essentially about the core, how does the government of Guernsey work? And for a lot of people, for example, Edwina, you'll know this and you'll probably know it much better than the study guide teaches it. And the study guide tries to teach it. You'll know a lot of the more the day-to-day practicalities, how things really work. Because sometimes when you, if you read a legal journal and it's on your subject, and it will say, well, this case has this effect and that case has that effect, and you'll say, well, actually, in reality, people don't behave like that at all. No. Judges weren't going off on one in that case. They were just following what was usually done. Because the reality of how law works on a day-to-day basis isn't necessarily always represented best in how it's described by academics, who are generally people who are on the outside. Perhaps less so, of course, in Jersey and Guernsey, because there are no pure Jersey and Guernsey academics. People like Gordon, people like myself, people like John Kelleher, we're all insiders as well. We actually practice at the same time, whereas a lot of academics, they literally, well, not literally, but they might as well be sitting in an ivory tower, never studying their hands with actual disputes and actual law, and just being good theoretically. So, States of Guernsey and an introduction to it. So the first thing, certain basic terminology. We have the States of Deliberation, which is the legislature, and committees in it form the executive. And this is an unusual thing if you've done your legal education outside of the Channel Islands, and particularly if you've done it in the USA, where obviously you have a very strict divide between what is the executive and what is the legislature. You also have the States of Election, which is basically just an electoral college for jurats nowadays. It's on the syllabus, so you need to know about it, although in actual fact it doesn't really impinge on day-to-day Guernsey life. In fact, there's one more thing which should really be on that slide, although it's probably too vastly a theoretical question, which is to actually say the States of Guernsey itself, and what does that mean? Because we have issues in Jersey as to what exactly the States of Jersey means. Is it the government? Is it the assembly? Is it the whole public sector shooting match? And in Guernsey, it's perhaps a little bit simpler in that there is no divide between the executive and the legislature. So essentially, you have States of Deliberation, which is the political embodiment of the States of Guernsey, and everything in administration is under that. There's no divide. You haven't got, as you have in Jersey at the moment, ministers as corporations sole, which gives rise to questions as to whether, if you talk about a minister, you're also talking about the States of Jersey. So things are perhaps a little bit simpler in Guernsey, which is why it didn't actually occur to me to put the States of Guernsey on that slide. But it is a different expression. You need to have a general idea that I should always have, that the States of Guernsey is a concept, not of the government as a whole and the legislature as a whole. So, historical background. Now, the origins of the States of Deliberation is unclear, and this isn't particularly surprising because in many ways the origins of the House of Commons are unclear. The origins of the French equivalents, if you were to go back that far into pre-revolutionary history, you don't really know how the House of Commons arose as such, when it really turned into a legislature in a more modern sense. Now, the first clear mention of an assembly is in 1538. Of course, you always have a problem with history in the Channel Islands, and as indeed elsewhere, which is the attrition of documents. You don't have everything to explain a nice, neat story. So even if it's assuming that it was all nicely written down at some stage, the documents don't actually exist. But it was clearly the first surviving mention. It clearly was a concept of a body that was consulted, involved in the government of Guernsey, which was taken to be a representative of Guernsey, just as even before Simon de Montfort ever created the model parliament, there was a concept in England of the king consulting the political nation. But suffice it to say, 1605, by order of James I and VI, the States of Deliberation is revived as a legislature. And this happens to be, if you remember from those of you who were here last time, this was the same time as we're getting the first complaints, these first complaints recorded by the 1848 commissioners, that the approbation had all gone terribly wrong, and that the royal court was applying a law which wasn't really the proper Guernsey law. So what, in a way, what better solution to that than to say, well, here you are, have a legislature that can, if you've got anything that really, really worries you, it can try and take action. So its original functions, as of the 16th century, was to essentially advisory as regards the royal court. The royal court, royal court was actually had legislative functions at that stage, which we'll go into later. Again, that isn't so much of a surprise in that if you look at more old constitutional history, royal judges in England were very much part of the executive in trying to make sure that everything went right. Magistrates were in charge of their local areas. So to have the royal court as the place that legislates wasn't that unusual. Now, what was important was that the states of deliberation consent to taxation was required. And of course, taxation is one of the key powers of any legislature, the right to give or withhold finance. Providing you're in a situation where the government needs money, that ultimately brings power into the legislature, into the representative assembly. So historically, this represents something basically like the general run of Western constitutional history. Monarchies were not really absolute, and the consent of the political nation was required. Now, if you want to think about it in terms of grand political history, it means that actually Guernsey just was getting its legislature firmly set up at the same time as much of Europe, including France, was actually dismantling those sort of organs of government. Now, the composition of the States of Deliberation was unclear at this time, but it did include the jurats. So, very unusually for sort of modern readers, the jurats, who of course were the heart and soul of the royal court at that time, were also to be found in the States of Deliberation. So there isn't really a great tension between the two, because they have a very, very similar, there's a considerable overlap in composition. States deliberations functions grow over time, and it grows over time basically because you need more money as society gets more complicated. Now, in ancient times, kings could rule under their own revenues. But if there's more military affairs, more forts that need building, bigger harbours to maintain, then you need more money. Therefore, you need to raise the money somehow. And of course, for an island such as Guernsey, you'd either have two choices. One is you get the money from the English crown, but of course, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So bringing in help from England would be a poisoned chalice. If you want to be independent, if you want to maintain your autonomy, you've got to raise the money internally, which means you've actually got to start asking the ordinary people, or at least the ones who are wealthy enough to be worth taxing. I mean, this is a fairly standard dynamic in constitutional growth. You have democratization really begins to get underway in the mid-19th century. And again, this is the same sort of time that democratization is getting underway in the United Kingdom, and also, if you discount the blip in 1848, in much of the rest of Europe. So in 1844, you have, as the States of Deliberations comprised of the jurats, the Attorney General, HM Procureur, the rectors, so the clergy is there, and 15 douzaines representatives, and previously it had been the constables. So if you're to be looking at a real, perhaps popular element to it, is to be found in the douzaine representatives, because they were made up of the essentially the parishes, the councils of the parishes, are much more in touch with the ordinary people.
Well, I think in reality, the constable, you look back at the constables remained their predominancy in parishes, and they remained as a more a
you're being represented by your squire,
yes.
but your squire is having to perhaps ask take a little bit more notice of the people. Yeah. Again, these are typical sort of elements in that particular period. In England and Wales, it was still the squires being elected in rotten-ish boroughs, and on open voting, so you couldn't dare vote against your own squire, even into the 1860s. So, sorry.
Squires where they actually voted by their parish parishioners. There was already been parish elections as still on today, but the electorate would have been the landowners, the property owners. The amount of democratisation of their role was quite narrowly focused.
And again, that's not surprising. It wasn't until after the First World War that those without property, without land or tenants, were enfranchised in the United Kingdom. So I think a third of men in the UK before the First World War didn't have a vote, as well as the entirety of women, which actually was one of the complications in franchising women at the time. So it had a different idea of what democracy and representation was about. Because if you view government as being about spending people's money, then it seemed to be more natural even into the first part of the 20th century that the decision should be taken by those whose money was being spent. And you can even read this if you ever actually read Dyce's books written in the Edwardian days, that he was very much a defender of the idea that you didn't get a vote if you were actually taking money from the government in terms of poor relief. Again, it's a shocking idea for modern people, but that was how things were seen in those days. So 1899, add 9 deputies. And you can see now that the douzaine representatives and the deputies are beginning to outweigh the rectors and the jurats, and these were elected by the chefs de famille, so essentially one household, one vote. And from 1892, that meant if a woman was a chef de famille, then she would get the vote. So essentially, you're voting by household, presuming that you own property or are renting an expensive enough house to be taken account of. So 1948, out go the jurats and the rectors. Now the jurats were actually thrown out in Jersey, on the states of Jersey, in the 18th century after a period of unrest. And it does go to show that essentially one of the drivers of democracy is how much people are annoyed by the people who are currently running the system. So the fact that the jurats ran to 1948 and the rectors were still there in 1948, on one hand, it does look terribly feudal and parochial, but on the other hand, it probably is a testament to it working reasonably well in practice. But in 1948, just had the end of the Second World War, you've got a Labour government in the UK, very much a more socialist era, and the idea of having your legislature with large numbers of basically judges and clergymen is definitely out. However, in come 12 councillors, conseillers, who like meant to perform a more senatorial function, and they were elected for 6 years, and they were elected by the states of election. Now, when we get to the states of election, we'll realise that this doesn't entirely destroy the particular political power of the jurats and the like, because they actually had votes in the states of election. But the whole idea of this was to have people who were the good and the great, the more respectable, the people who had a great name on the island, could provide some sort of ballast for the assembly. Because again, societies tend to move by small steps. They're getting rid of an oligarchy of sort of a legal and a ecclesiastical oligarchy, but they're moving to a different form of oligarchy, but one that's slightly more democratized, and they hope will have greater competence for running the island.
So also what I think that in the context of the time that we are in, just emerging from 5 years of German occupation, where there had been little put into the infrastructure other than German fortifications, and there was a great need to build around. An awful lot of housing had been occupied by German forces and organisation territory office. So this actually completely devastated what people had been evacuated at the start of the war or deported during the occupation, were returning. Their houses that had been left empty effectively had been ruined. But furniture had all been burnt because there was no coal, nothing else to burn. And when that ran out, the wood panelling, the rafters, etc., it went onto the grate to provide warmth. So it was a time where the island needed that stability that perhaps in the past, certainly the Durats would have been seen. The concierge were that actually it's that difference that they're not also sitting in judgment in the royal court, but they're of peers. Then to say there was that equal standing in society. The people you look up to in those days, the people you would have, the gentleman would have doffed his cap to on the high street. And it's important, helpful to put it in that context as to what else was going on around at the time.
I mean, those who call the shots in societies often quake in fear of populism. That's when you know from the papers today. So here you're getting these people, and they are a democratically credible element, but nevertheless still an anti-populist element, a ballast in the system, particularly at a time when you've got to recall there's extremely radical change going on in the United Kingdom. So it's actually, it's very much an element of not going down that more sort of revolutionary approach that was going on with the creation of the welfare state. Genuine fears in the UK that there would be much more in the way of almost communist revolution, and the House of Lords would be got rid of and everything. But so you end up with a position where you have now deputies, councillors, and douzaine representatives, and that works for about 50 years. But it's a bit of a hodgepodge of a system, and it's to some extent still the system that they have in Jersey at the moment. In 2012, concierges are replaced by deputies. So that's direct democracy. And in 2004, the douzaine representatives are themselves replaced by deputies. So you have...
Not 2000. They become in 1994. They shifted from being elected by the state's election, so it was public member for a 6-year term. So the 12 were elected initially on a 6-year, on the first 6 for a 6-year term, the second 6 for a 3-year term, and then they went 2000. Actually, no, it is 2000. I'll get some from here. 2000. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, 94 to 2000. Yes.
So so I remember there was somebody who wrote into Jersey Evening Press saying he was one of the last senators in the state's deliberation in Guernsey. So you've got a move away from oligarchy to representative, and then a move away from indirect to direct elections, and that's an important thing. Direct elections, because that's meant to be your electorate's chance to throw them out. It's usually a expression put slightly differently, but your chance to actually vote directly for change, as opposed to indirect elections, where you have the difficulty that you're electing your parish representatives, and at the same time you're electing the people who are going to choose who's going to toddle off from the douzaine and go on to the states. So you're not really actually focused on the state's element to that, not really focusing on their business as a representative in the state's deliberation. You're focused on who you want to be in your parish council, which is one of the reasons why in Jersey they have 12 constables. They sit in the state's assembly, and of those 12, does anyone know how many contested elections? 1. So, and that was the same one that was contested the previous time, just a different result this year. So because people are much more focused on, oh, is this the right man, right woman who's representing our parish nicely and keeping the grass mowed and everything like that, they don't end up not voting for them. So there's end up not having elections. There's actually 11 people sitting there simply because everyone's more or less satisfied with their parish work and without any sort of regard to what they're thinking in terms of what they're going to do in the actual state's assembly itself. So that's one of the downsides of that particular system. And if I was doing this in Jersey, I'd then go for the upsides of that particular system. But we don't have to worry about it here because you've just got deputies and only deputies. So the composition, this is the current composition, and I will obviously need help as regards what happens next. I'll have to make a few comments and then hand over to Liz. There are 38 deputies in multi-member constituencies. That means you can keep a good handle on who you are electing. There's 5 or 6 people in a particular constituency. It's possible for the constituents themselves to roughly know who those people are. Are they good, sensible people? Are they eccentrics, or are they, raving lunatics? This can happen. And you can go to your hustings. I'm sure. Do you have hustings? You can go to your constituency hustings, as lots of people do, and you can get a good impression of who is the right man or woman to deserve your vote. There are 2 ordinary representatives, and 2 ordinary representatives are not deputies. They have the same role as deputies. They can vote on any issues, whether it's an ordinary issue or not, but they are there to represent Alderney and states of Alderney. They're chosen by the states of Alderney. Alderney is not involved in Guernsey general elections. You then have the law officers themselves, the procureur and the comptroller, and they do not vote. They provide legal advice to the assembly if it's called upon, as they are the legal advisors to the states of Guernsey as a whole. The bailiff sits as president, presiding officer. The legislation always refers to the presiding officer, not to the bailiff. And the bailiff similarly has no vote, which we'll get to later and is quite important. Now, the bailiff is Guernsey's civil head. That means he is the embodiment of Guernsey as a community on civic functions. That's why the bailiff will be the one who does the speech on Liberation Day, I would assume. You don't have a suit?
It's his office that organises the Liberation Day service.
So in the order of precedence, he's above the Lieutenant Governor.
Oh, that's... No, because the
Lieutenant Governor is the Queen. Yeah, so it can't be...
So it's not
So other than the Queen and someone standing in for the Queen, Lieutenant Governor is at the top of the order of precedence.
He will lay his route first. On remembrance on these. That's the only time he was obviously there's been a previous chief minister got very upset that he felt he could lay the wreath after Edwin's already shutting. Lay his wreath after the Lieutenant Governor because he was chief minister, to the extent that he then refused to attend Remembrance Day services. And we always, at the start of the year, we always put in the diary that he was out of the island. One year, he put the Remembrance Sunday fell on the 12th of November. The Remembrance Sunday was on the Saturday, the Remembrance Day was on the Saturday. Equally, he's out of the island on the 12th, rather than the previous Sunday. But that was his process, was the Bailiwick Paper process. So, yeah, it became very, very, very petty for a time.
But it's well, I used to work in Gibraltar, so there's similar tensions. But in the UK, the Prime Minister certainly used to be below the Lord Chancellor.
Yeah.
Obviously, now they've basically gutted that office, probably not. So.
The Lieutenant Governor.
The Lieutenant Governor remains the Queen's representative.
He was nice. Just curious.
Yeah, the role is very much, the Lieutenant role is very much in respect of the governance of Guernsey to the UK, back to the UK, to the Crown, rather than in a civic role.
But
it's an apolitical role, often, although oftentimes they do seem to meddle with it.
So the office of bailiff derives from the wardens that were sent by the Crown, the Channel Islands, after 1248. So this is the point where the kings of England were basically saying, okay, we're going to, that's it, I should say, is it 1248 or something, 1448? But sending someone to actually control the island locally. So that essentially you have a separate local administration, you're not incorporating it in any way into the English administration. That's why I think that definitely is 1348, because it's Edward III who sent it after he decided that he was, as he was the King of France, he was going to rule Guernsey and Jersey as such. It's a Crown appointment, so it's not a States appointment. I mean, States has no control over who gets appointed to the role, and States cannot dismiss the bailiff. It also means that if the States do not like the bailiff's job as presiding officer, they can't do anything to remove him as presiding officer other than to redefine the role completely. Now, since the 19th century, it's been the job of a qualified lawyer. If you go back far enough, it would have been a what they called a sinecure, a role that was given to somebody because they were someone's mate in the court, who would then never actually get as far as Guernsey or Jersey, and would just bank his salary and use it to pay somebody else to get on the boat and do something in the island. So the bailiff's real role, and main role, is to be responsible for law, procedure and costs in the royal court. The bailiff is the chief judge of the royal court. It is very much the bailiff's court. Ex officio, by statute, President of the Guernsey Court of Appeal, which leads to the rather strange situation which exists in Jersey as well, that the same judge, whether they sit in the royal court or the Court of Appeal, can entirely change the standing of their judgments. Because obviously, if the bailiff is in the royal court, that's the first instance court, Court of Appeal, binding on the royal court and strictly binding according to the precedent that exists in Guernsey. And if you're the bailiff and you're sitting there with two QCs from England, and the question is one of Guernsey customary law, you're going to get your own way almost certainly. I think that's probably right. And it's the same if your bailiff comes over to Jersey, will tend to dominate if it's an area of real local interest law. But by being in the Court of Appeal, you get to have more status. Yes. Yes, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So because the bailiff doesn't sit on every day in the States. There's also the deputy bailiff might sit, and also there's a vast amount of legislation which dates to before the bailiff became bailiff, or before the bailiff became one of the law officers, because often they will be involved in the state procedures and might be criticised in the same way. So it isn't every case where they're going to be forced to accuse themselves. And
so is the point that we can make law at Court of Appeal
you can make a more powerful precedent.
So which should be done by law.
So yes, and this, I don't know if this happens in Guernsey, but there are certain jurisprudential schisms within the Jersey's professional judiciary. Certainly, you'd say William Ballash is a more of a traditional lawyer, and he's the bailiff. In some areas, the previous bailiff, Michael Burt, and the current lieutenant bailiff, Tim McCock, are more open to English common law influence, particularly in areas of contract. So one of them might go up to the Court of Appeal and do something that's binding or sort of more authoritative, and it probably isn't how they feel, but from the outside it looks like one of them's getting something over on the other by being able to move into a higher position and pull rank, even though they actually should already be even though they could just as equally have been here in that case at first instance. So whether or not Michael Burt is in the Court of Appeal hearing a case that William Ballash was first instance might be just a matter of coincidence, because they could just equally have swapped roles. So it's an odd situation if you have a lack of jurisprudential consistency amongst the judges themselves. Because what should happen when you have a small judiciary is that they should talk to each other and generally coalesce around common ideas. I remember sitting in a judge shadowing in Bromley, and one of the judges doing some procedure where he'd give an idea of how a case will come out, and what he'd say is, I won't sit on the case because I'm doing this now, one of my fellow judges will. We all talk to each other, we all know each other, we all have roughly similar ideas as to how those cases should be decided. So if I say it, it's a fair guide to how the rest of my fellow Bromley judges will come out. And the thing is that in Jersey, in some areas, that isn't the case. And this divide between the Royal Court and the Court of Appeal, where all these judges can sit, well, all the three that, Burt and William Ballash can sit, and Tim McCock will be able to sit when he takes over next year, it creates a certain bizarre consequence that where they happen to sit make a big difference to how authoritative they are, when really it's the same judge who should only be as good as their opinions, their reasons. Does that make sense? Well, do you have it in the state's deliberation? Because sometimes neither the bailiff or the lieutenant bailiff preside, and the greffier will preside, and sometimes they will do that if the subject matter under discussion is too legally, judicially sensitive. So, for example, when they discuss legal aid, it's probable that neither the bailiff nor the deputy bailiff will actually preside in Jersey. The greffier will sit instead.
The greffier can't sit as the system is if the bailiff or deputy bailiff is either feels it is necessary to recuse himself from sitting, or for whatever reason. Yeah, this last week the deputy bailiff had been taken ill. Bailiff was off the island. We have a system of 3 states members, between those senior state members are appointed as acting presiding officers. So the 3 no senior is determined by time in office. So it's Deputy Lowe, Deputy Gollop, and the third one is taking me at the moment. I have to remind myself. But they would quite literally step up to the chair if the matter is the matter. The only one I can think that's kicking around at the moment that may come in is the register for themselves. Public sector pension. They're also looking at pensions for Crown officers and judges. But if the states were voting on the pension scheme for the bailiff, it wouldn't be appropriate for the bailiff or deputy bailiff to sit. So, deputy bailiff, God, would sit, and equally there is also provision for the law officers, for controller or procureur. There is a procureur, and there are procureur and controllers delegate. So again, for the legal advice, I'm not sure who the delegate is at the moment.
Well, I know that certain functions are directors. So
Yeah, that's the controller delegate. There is provision to have somebody in to give that independent legal advice. Same with pensions, it's quite a good example. Yeah, the procureur and the controller are in that same pension fund. So it wouldn't be appropriate for them to be giving legal advice to the states on something that was surplus.
Probably the directory of service electrical.
No, the procureur delegate is from private practice.
Because if we have an acting attorney general, it's somebody who's a Crown advocate. So it'll be somebody who's internal, but it won't necessarily be the highest ranking civil service, because that person might not actually be a lawyer, might not actually be an advocate rather.
Of the states of Guernsey and Scotland to proper delegates from private practice.
Okay. We have nothing like that.
There is that ability to try and get the sort of McDonald principles in place.
When you say you choose, it's just one of the 3 that will say.
Yes. It would normally be in order of precedence, and I'm just finding anybody fit to get up to the presiding officer.
It's just
I can fairly do think of, and I can't think of what it was about. Many years ago, because they're fairly sat from that, and I suspect it was something on pensions or salaries.
Yeah.
okay. So, presiding officer acts as moderator and rules on questions of procedure. Now, one of the things that happens, and again, you won't find this in the any of the books. In Jersey, the bailiff will tend to vet proposals for legality and raise any queries at that particular stage before allowing them forward onto the to be lodged. Does the bailiff do that in Guernsey?
Therefore, it's now that policy letters and propositions are lodged through the rep, and there is no scrutiny at the point of lodging. There is a requirement in the rules of procedure that the law officers have looked at the policy letter and the propositions and have confirmed that they don't offend, what, they're human rights compliant, that sort of thing. And equally, theoretically, that applies to amendments, to propositions, that there is a time frame by which they need to be submitted. There is an expectation that they will consult with the law officers to get to assist with the drafting of them. But as with any rules of procedure, there's a rule that allows them to suspend the rules of procedure. So very often you will be getting late amendments or consequential amendments, submitted effectively on the back of a fact packet in the royalty chamber. And very often, if you're listening to the state, you will hear the bailiff, the deputy bailiff, asking the law officers, sort of look through it, that doesn't look right, and ask the proctor or controller to advise as to whether or not the drafting of the amendment, and usually gives the law officer a clue as to where he is thinking that it is wrong. But the presiding officer, very much take that role of presiding, of being the guardian of the procedure of the rules. Certainly Richard Mann is very, very hot on the rules, much the frustration of it's one of those, if you can, it's a useful sort of thing to get a feel for it, to either listen and go, what's the state's at play, as it were, and see the difference between how the bailiff and the deputy bailiff manage the chamber. It is quite different, and you get a much bigger panoply of rules. The deputy bailiff does saying, sorry, we're under the rule, whatever, and there's no provision for this. And they used to have a procedure for asking a question of somebody and saying, it's either a point of correction or a point of order. That's a question. I think it's probably one of my favourite expressions. It's helpful, particularly those who just told by the fact that if you haven't grown up in Guernsey, it's a good way of getting a feel to take, those very much stuff, to take the text off the page. If we can't, even if it's just listening in whilst you're in the office, it's a helpful as well. Probably not worth it at the end of January because there's only about 3 hours of business on this agenda.
Okay, I think
possibly we've got the next, whilst the state's decision in December, so I think this is quite interesting.
You have the meeting arrangements, or can you just turn up?
You just turn up, so it's in roll call. So just turn up and sit back there, or listening on Radio Guernsey. You get a very good feel from it on Radio Guernsey. But again, useful, and I think possibly until it's fun whilst all this stuff is very current to you. It's not good time. Something else certainly recommend. I think Irene will probably go in and come on that with you in government. It's something you perhaps within government you take for granted, but you get a sense of it. That's fine.
it is quite useful to have somebody who knows about the law and about the business of legislation, who can actually point other people to say, well, is there an issue here? Because you seem to do it actually on the floor of the chamber. The bailiff in Jersey tends to do it behind the scenes much earlier. But given that it's a much, much smaller jurisdiction with a much smaller civil service and a smaller law officers department in comparison to the UK, but the questions are quite often the same, it can be quite useful to have that extra check just to raise a question and make you think, and somebody who perhaps is familiar to what has gone wrong and what issues have arisen in the past, which particularly, when you just start off in the law officers, you don't necessarily have that. There's a lot of institutional memory in the bailiff, I think I'm trying to say. Okay. So the deputy bailiff office created in 1969 carries out the functions of the bailiff. So not much more to say than that, just that it's useful to have two rather than one. And although one has greater seniority, when they're sitting in the Royal Court, they're both judges of the Royal Court, and you can't say, well, this was done by the bailiff, therefore it's a more important judgment.
Yeah.
No.
That's probably about the only kind of distinction.
So I have the law officers themselves, HM Procureur, which is effectively the Attorney General, HM Controller, which is effectively the Solicitor General. And it can be very useful to have two of them because sometimes, particularly in a system where government isn't centralised, you can have different parts of it asking questions and you can give it to different law officers. And often I'm sure you have the case here, particularly here, where you can have backbenchers on issues wanting to raise. Can they raise questions direct to the law officers?
Yeah. So much one of managing that they're encouraged if they want to go and be asking questions at the committee, usually they're not a member or to actually use the officers within St James Community to help them pitch the stuff. But it probably is only in respect of amendments, propositions, that they would routinely come.
Because you've got much more under control here with backbenchers. Because
less in the way of, because of not in the executive form of government, there's more committee seats. There's more, so I think the majority, there's 1 or 2 members that don't have a seat on a committee at the moment. So they've got something of their own to meddle with. They don't need to meddle anywhere else. But that's a cynical way of looking at it. But they're Delphi's work right at hand. It equally applies to politicians as to small children.
yeah. So they advise the states of deliberation on law, but otherwise silent, which means that you can have cases where the law officers hold very strong points. They might even be points which could be asked as questions of law or constitution, but if no one asks them, they stay on their seat. They are Crown appointments. And again, this is actually a very important thing for a small community, is to have independence of the rule of law function, because it is very much a rule of law function. It's the law officers keep the executive, they keep the government of Jersey within the law, because by and large, there isn't that much public interest litigation that's going to go on. You need people who are outside government to say, well, actually, no, you can't do that because your public finances law doesn't permit it. It may be a silly thing, but that's what the law says. So you don't have quite the what you'll get in England and Wales, where the Attorney General and the Solicitor General are very much political appointees and therefore tend to be amenable and have a strong, what I suppose you would call choice bias, selection bias, I think they call it. Selection bias, a psychological term. Selection bias to conform to what the government wants. Now, if you have a small island where everybody is entirely on side and walking in the same direction, you can very easily end up like Turks and Caicos, which was the island which had its government withdrawn by the United Kingdom because it had become so corrupt. Criminal proceedings are brought by the law officers. You have no conception, as in Jersey, of a private prosecution, do you? So essentially that means that you only get hauled in front of the court on a criminal charge by the law officers themselves. It also means, of course, that the government can't prosecute you because it wants to. Ex officio head of the Guernsey Bar, which isn't true in Jersey, which might be one reason why in recent headlines in the papers that there might be a big fight and the lawyers might go on strike. And the law officers of Guernsey are also the law officers of Alderney and Sark, which is one of the ways in which the bailiwick has a real practical existence, even though the islands are different jurisdictions in many ways. On the wrong thing. I hope you will not be asked any questions about the greffier, sheriff, and sergeant. It's there in the study guide. Greffier is clerk, again, independent of the government of Jersey, essentially the legislature's administration. And the role of the others is to carry out the ministerial functions, it's called. In the office of HM Sheriff and HM Sergeant enforces royal court decisions.
That's why it should be HM.
Okay.
There's work in the background to look at separating the roles and promotions greffier and having a similar role in Jersey to the state's greffier.
Because logically speaking, the administration of the State's Assembly should be subordinate to the State's Assembly and answerable only to the State's Assembly. But it does ensure that the administration doesn't get wrapped up into the general business of government and place the legislature underneath the executive, but more precisely or more practically, often underneath the civil service.
John Todd. There's a whole raft of deputy greffiers, but largely that's to cover for the matrimonial legislation that you've got to do solemnise to deal with civil marriages. You have to be a deputy greffier, which is about everybody in the greffier sworn as a deputy greffier. And registering deaths, birth arrangements and deaths.
In court as well, is that just
If you only sit as the clerk, you would sit with it, he and other greffiers would sit as clerk in both the states.
he does himself as well? Yes. How do you see him actually?
He occasionally will clerk court. If the state's meeting runs for 4 days, probably see him doing it. It's normally Christine Costa and Alan Ross that will be doing the state.
Because in Jersey you have a judicial greffier,
Yeah.
so the royal court role is carried out by the judicial greffier, separate administration, and the greffier is a judge, and there are lots of substitute greffiers who can carry out judicial functions, but again, almost everybody becomes a substitute greffier because anyone who has to stamp a piece of paper, which is, is carrying out a judicial function of sorts. So people's deputies, 38 of them, go back to this. Any person over the age of 18, 12 months ordinary residence in Guernsey, so you don't have to rule that you have to be a British citizen.
Yeah.
Not sent to prison in the UK or Crown dependencies for 6-month term within the previous 5 years. Murders in France is therefore permitted.
Also covers where you've had a community order that is in direct substitute for what would have been a term of imprisonment of 6 months or more. So if you've had a whack of 240 hours of community service, and the judge in the judgment is sentencing has said I would have been sending you to prison for 8 months, but I've listened to the character references. That would then mean that you can't sign. Interestingly, it's going to crop up in the next couple of weeks, there isn't a similar provision in SARC. And in actual fact, one of the candidates in for SARC's general election later this month is, I think he's only just out from quite a hefty sentence for fraud.
Do they have enough candidates this time?
They did it. They did. They got 15 for 9 seats. 9 seats. He's like the 10th candidate, and people go, "Oh, this is ridiculous." But then another 5 came in at the last minute. So yeah, there isn't a similar provision in SARC.
It's the lady from the sublimaries going back on me. The ordinary representatives, we said earlier, they're chosen by the states of ordinary, they're not directly elected, so they're there for the ordinary interest, even though they can vote on everything. Now we get to, which I'll soon hand over to Liz, island-wide voting. So you had a referendum with 5 options for electing 38 members, despite the disastrous Jersey referendum, which had 3 options and was rejected in part because nothing by the states, because no one actually had a majority and almost no one turned up to vote as well. It's another problem. So the one which won, 38 members, and each elector has 38 votes. Now, it wouldn't have been necessary to have had 38 votes per elector. In Gibraltar, they have 17 members of their parliament, but each elector only has 10 votes, which means that you don't actually have to, or don't have no temptation to try and find 38 people, or just vote for the ones you actually want to and then tick off another 20. But of course, if you have only 10 votes in Gibraltar, what it means is that it helps to promote political parties, because it's good if you have a slate of 10 people who are standing together and all your and like-minded people's votes are concentrated on those 10. So what you end up having in Gibraltar is 2 political parties, effectively, and they both put up a slate of 10 people, and one gets 10 elected and the other gets 7 elected. Under option A, you have 38 votes. There's nothing to promote political parties, nothing that would try and promote alliances, because that's actually far too many people to form a slate of 38 with, and there's no point in having a slate of 38 unless people are going to put all 38 votes down. Option B, I think, is basically the current system. Option C, a bit like Jersey, which is that you would have 10 island-wide deputies. So there, the aim would be that you would have the sort of more senior people would want to have the island-wide mandate. It would be an option to get an endorsement for why you should be head of the Policy and Resources Committee, or why you should be one of the high-up people in the states. You gain prestige by coming higher up the ballot paper, while still having district representatives with more local links. Option D, it's like option B, but not making quite as much sense, which is probably why very few people actually voted for it. Option E is probably a better version of option A, because at least then you have manageable hustings and a manageable election every 2 years. It has a disadvantage that you can't vote the government out very easily, but then without parties you can't do that either. And the winner was option A, which didn't actually attract that many exchange votes or the alternative votes?
Yeah, I was lead officer for the referendum officer, lived and breathed the referendum. It was really originally started candidates as the ballot boxes were open, voted. Very few people had used any of their preferential votes. The vast majority of voters just opted for a single option. And I think if more people use their preferential votes, we may have had a very different outcome. Just a slight typo on the slide, option C was the option left in the final one up against option A, not option B.
Oh, sorry.
So that was that. The turnout was 45%, and the states have agreed to hold themselves bound by the outcome if the turnout is 40% or above. So the position now is that the States Assembly and Constitution Committee are trying to work out how the hell to make an election work, where you potentially got a ballot paper with.
Do you know how long it's going to take to count the votes? Because I volunteered for vote counting in Gibraltar when I was there, and there, so you've got 10 votes. Yeah. It's only 30,000 people in Gibraltar. You've got a much smaller electorate, so there's only about 17,000 votes cast, or well, probably much less than that. And it took until 6 in the morning to finish the counting, and that's 10 votes. 38 and a larger electorate.
Yeah. So certainly in the recent past, we've been counting up to 13 votes since we talked pre-2004. When at one stage, just on the population number of representatives, at one stage, some people had 13. And that used to finish about 3 in the morning, which again, we're just counting one, albeit the biggest parish, but one parish. I dread to think how long it's going to be. There's some discussion as to whether you can get one electronically read. They're actually presenting the more pressing issue is presenting the electorate with a ballot paper with potentially 90, 80 to 100 names on it. There are 85, 86 candidates in the 2016 election across all the districts. And then asking them to pick up to 38.
But there must be positives that people would have chosen it. I suppose the positive is that you at least know who are the most popular people.
Yes, I think the big is that I think there will be some very clear winners, so sort of top 10 will probably be way out in front. And there will be a sort of bottom 10 of no hopers. In the middle, I suspect, and particularly once you get down to sort of who is ranked at 25th to 50th, there's going to be a matter of votes between it. Heaven only knows how you actually deal with a recount, because you could have it's not beyond the wit of man that you actually have 10 candidates that are within within sort of half a dozen votes of actually having got in big 39 votes. Yeah.
I mean, we could have had a recount in Jersey. There was a recount last time, the senatorial, and there would have been a recount this time, but the lady concerned was a very practical lady who basically campaigned on the basis of her dog. And it was a very nice dog. And she was a very nice dog, and she was very well qualified. And I just been doing her disservice. But simply by standing in the main shopping street with her dog and talking to people, she actually came from nowhere to fraction nearly getting elected as senator, because She was approachable. She was sensible. And I think if she'd prepared properly, for instead of trying to talk extempore at the hustings, I think she'd have been elected.
In '94, when concierge was first elected by INI suffrage, the position between the 12th and 13th candidate was less than 20 votes, and we went to a recount on that. And at that stage, the reform law required that the recount took place in the Royal Court. It was before the redevelopment of the Royal Court, and we were there on a Saturday morning, and quite literally finding places, sitting on stairs and counting every inch of the Royal Court building was used with vast numbers of civil servants working for the weekend recount the ballot papers in the bailiff's office, the Durex room. I remember sitting on that first staircase. Going up, yeah. But now
What happened to the votes there?
no, it's actually flipped. It actually flipped. Yeah.
Well, did one of them, and none, if one, I was just trying to think, did the Arizona recount in America flip? Or was it for the Democrats first time? Because I think the Florida one, the Florida one nearly flipped. So
I think it's the only time.
now I would love to set a question on this, personally, with party politics. There's usually for and against, but let's just start off with against, because there were no parties. Yeah. And what are the advantages of that? Because there were advantages of that. And I'll give what I think is the main advantage, which is something I noticed, and you said it earlier about listen to a debate in the States. Well, if you can listen to a debate where there's actually real disagreement within the States, you'll hear something which you will not hear normally, although you will in a couple of weeks' time, in the House of Commons. It's an actual proper debate, one where people's votes are actually there to be swung. So there can be real consideration as to whether or not the government's line is correct. The government in Jersey lost badly, for example, on Sunday voting. I'm sure you can come up with examples where proposals have been lost because they weren't popular enough with the general run of the chamber. You don't have whips, party whips, telling people they have to vote in a particular way. You don't have members obliged to vote in a particular way because it's going to embarrass their party. So it creates what should be a much more consensual basis. Everybody's vote can count, because you never know, whether a particular eccentric deputy, whether their vote is going to be the crucial vote in a later election. So you just can't ignore them and treat them with contempt. So, I mean, even before they formed a party in Jersey, there was an obvious phalanx of sort of more left-wing deputies, and they had to be taken into account. They would stand up, they would deliver their speeches, even when they had no hope of actually winning. And every now and then they would score a hit. Wouldn't happen particularly if you had party politics, because then there would be just a small eccentric party to be, treated like Plaid Cymru or the Liberal Democrats these days. And one of the big problems of having party politics is you don't actually have any parties. You can't just magic a party out of thin air. You need to have a coalescing of opinion, coalescing into groupings with loyalty within the party. 4, and this is what you realise is the downside, having sat through debates and thought, actually this is great, these are proper debates. You then sit through an election and you realise that nothing actually changes at the end of it. Because by and large, the people who run the show are usually, whether they're right or wrong, the more impressive people and the more competent people. and voting them out en masse would be a very difficult thing. And particularly if you had a system where you had elected only a small number of island-wide deputies, you would, to change government, effectively have to get rid of your most competent politicians. The competent politicians might be doing entirely the wrong thing, but that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. So elections without parties are based on personalities. They're based on impressions. Often they're based on who has a good local following. And parties which lack a local following can be entirely ignored where you'd think they would actually gather votes. So, in my example here in Jersey is that the actual changes caused by the Jersey election, if you actually looked at who retired before the election, that made the difference. There's a large number of people who would have voted for Ian Gorst who retired, and a very small number of people who would have voted for John Lafondre who retired. But there's only two people actually lost their seats. One of them was a constable in the own constable election, and the other one was someone who decided that they were going to stand for senator and didn't realise that actually it's actually quite difficult making that particular step, because there's only 8 seats and you don't necessarily have an island-wide reputation, even if you have a strong states and local reputation. But the good thing about party politics is you can vote out the government. The government has a manifesto that it stands on. Probably a limit to what I should say given my job. But it is the case, and you can guess the issue, that you can sit in the hustings and hear exactly the same speeches from everybody on certain subjects, and yet nothing changes. So you can have a position where it seems as if everybody in the entire state agrees that something needs to be done about something, and yet nothing actually gets done, because there's no one that you can specifically point the finger at and say, well, you failed, you go. Except maybe the chief minister. But just changing the chief minister doesn't necessarily change that much. It's just one person.
Reading for years, I read many manifestos. You've got to say something like, I can guess what everybody's going to say in the next manifesto. Yeah, and it becomes very much, you look back to the 2016 election, and a large number of members did not retain their seats, but it was planning and infrastructure that did it. Some of the members of the environment department, did badly because people were fed up with either planning applications that they made that didn't get approved, or planning applications that they proposed that did get approved. Traffic congestion, and I think, I suspect that even in 2020, the issue of the number of additional roads being made 25 miles an hour, by the fact that it's early 2 in the morning, you couldn't have driven them down at 35 miles an hour, nothing to do with it. But the members of environment and infrastructure may struggle more because of that decision, rather than anything else that they have done.
Yeah.
That is, it's interesting. The movies, there doesn't seem to be a strong appetite, but I will use the word alliances because that's the word they keep using if it's not a party, because it's no whip, etc., etc. It's an alliance. But equally, I was reminded of during the referendum hustings, Advocate Perro, who was speaking on behalf of Option C, said to call it a political alliance is a weasel word for a party. And I thought that's a phrase that's worth remembering. I don't feel, my gut feeling is that there isn't a strong appetite in Guernsey yet by the electorate to be voting for particular people because they are in the islanders without the apostrophe association, the 2020 association, or whatever other ones crop up with charters. It's going to be much more on how somebody is like.
But you may find with your 38 candidates that people, to make themselves memorable, are going to try and club together. I mean, and you've seen it even as we've got the Reform Party, but there was one group of candidates in one of the constituencies, which had 3 candidates, three seats in that particular constituency, and there was 3 who said, no, we're not a political party, we just have our names on the same poster because we're very supportive of each other. And you kind of think, yeah, they're not a party, okay, believe that. But you can have those sorts of tendencies. But I think whilst you've still got government by committee, then you will have it. That's perhaps, I haven't put down there, something which is going to push away from having parties. Because, why? Why? Because the committees have to work together and have to be staffed by deputies, and you're unlikely to be able to get a party to actually win a majority and staff all the committees. Whereas in Jersey, because you've got a executive of 10 or 11 ministers, there must come a particular point where those 10 or 11 ministers will begin to coalesce around a manifesto to vindicate what they've done in the last 4 years. And you could see that many of the ministers in the previous administration were actually very close to each other.
It doesn't have the committee here to choose by the rest of the chamber.
Yes, the chamber. So
that is theoretically possible. If you become the head of the committee, you could choose people subject to them being elected who have similar values to you.
You could, but the whole concept of having it by committee rather than minister is because you buy into the concept of consensual government and carrying things out, where you are a committee of the states as a whole, rather than what you have in Jersey, where the ministers are increasingly forming a single executive. And actually the plan is for them to become a single executive. So even though they're going to be elected individually, it's going to be a single entity government, which we don't need to explain, and nor can I.
and also the rules of procedure allow for members who do not sit with. So committees is presented a policy letter. If one or more, so it goes for a majority. So for dissenting members at the moment, the one or two who have dissented against it, they can present a minority report, and they're actually what propositions they would have wanted. Indeed, if there are 2 dissenting, they could present 2 separate minority reports. So with that process, then actually, even if you had all the committees that political association with Party A had managed to populate with at least 3, so they could get their political party's position through. The minority reports would still be there for debate, unless of course going forward that rule was also would have to be repealed. I think that's a rule states members quite like to have in their bag, that if they fall out with their committee, they don't have to resign, they can still express their view, and they very often do.
The more you have the ideas of the government being a single entity marching in a single coordinated direction, the more you're going to have a tendency for it to have a united manifesto, a united concept of ideas, and to be accountable at the end of their term on that, to actually, it makes sense for them to stand together and say, we want to be re-elected for this particular idea, and then for backbenchers who support them to be rallying to their flag. Whereas if your idea is, we just elect the best 49 people who then sit down and work it out, which is the committee model, the current model, that parties don't really have a particular place in that sort of concept. Now I get to a favourite question in the Jersey one. I'd like to have, if I get involved in the actually second question, there should be one on this. It's a nice question. It's got elements of law and elements of constitutional propriety to it. It has to be said, and again, it comes down to where people get irritated and where they don't, whether or not this is a live question. It's a very much a live question in Jersey, because rightly or wrongly, some people disagree with the current bailiff. And they also disagreed when Sir Philip Balash went from being bailiff to standing as a senator, and they are nearly getting elected as chief minister. So that kind of revived, I think, the issue. Otherwise, it should really be a fairly theoretical issue as to whether or not it's constitutionally good to have somebody who's a judge and a presiding officer. Now, where this really comes from was the McGonigal case, which came from Guernsey, where it was held that somebody was denied their Article 6 rights, fair trial, because the bailiff had presided at the trial and had also presided when the relevant law was passed. This was said to be an appearance of bias, and it should be noted that that appearance is also based on other then existing formal roles that the bailiff had. It should be said, as I think said in one of the articles on this subject in the Joseph Guernsey Law Review, in all this time the bailiff said nothing. The article's called "The Dog That Didn't Bark." I forget who wrote it, just off the top of my head. The bailiff said nothing in the States of Deliberation, in the entire deliberations on it, nor in any of the committees which considered the law, but it was nevertheless thought that there was an appearance of bias. So should the bailiff stay as presiding officer? Well, one of the things that was always said in the past was that the Lord Chancellor was a judge and had judicial capacity in England and Wales and presided in the House of Lords, but that has since ceased, and the only places where a judge is a presiding officer is Jersey and Guernsey. Now, Guernsey's response was good, and I would say it's very, very sensible, which was to deal with the real problems. So, if your problem is that there's an appearance of bias, then that should be raised by the council concerned. It shouldn't essentially be a card you keep in your back pocket to complain about if you lose. So if you are a litigator, you often have been in cases where the judge has said, well, you know, I do have money in the Abbey National. Is that a problem for me here in this case? And counsel just say, no, of course not. Or alternatively, you'll have a case where all the jurors are asked beforehand, you know, do you have shares in the Abbey National? And if they say yes, it's, well, goodbye, please. And, you know, maybe you'll get called for another one because this is a massive fraud against the Abbey National, and you might take it a little personally. So you have to deal with those things at the start. Bailiff no longer is involved in the legislation committee, the appointments board, rules and procedure committee, placed at greater length. Legislation committee is about developing legislation, so that actually there's a much more of a, is that right? But those sort of committees are a really good place to have an effect on the actual content of legislation, actually far more so than what takes place within the State Assembly itself, which will largely nod through things unless they're particularly controversial.
There's not usually quite a bit of thinking. heavy amending of legislation following legislation review committee, and that, because it's now a mix of states members and senior lawyers in senior advocates in private practice. So you've got the we've got to go to court and rely, you know, and we're going to be absolutely using this legislation either to defend our cases. I think it's a good scrutiny process.
It's very useful to have those outside ideas, because sometimes you just, from inside, you just don't think of things, and you just, some ways the point, and you just think, yeah, I feel like a real idiot today. But if someone's actually has a day-to-day involvement in that area of law, then they have, what they have to say is invaluable.
Very focused that it wants to drive through particular piece of legislation. The draftsman of James Chambers and the officers are only advising, so can only advise so far, so it thoroughly digs its heels in. You know, the view is that actually this isn't good law, without that scrutineering role, the legislation review committee, that there is a risk that actually it's a very popular piece of legislation, and that could go through, and actually it's a completely ineffective one. Just against lots of.
I mean, for some of you, 20 years ago feels like a long time ago, but you know, in the late 90s, law lords were still sitting in the House of Lords, and there was certainly one famous occasion where they actually piloted legislation through the House of Lords, because it was actually to overturn a recent law lord decision where they said, well, actually, this was to do with mortgage fraud, where they said, well, actually, we have to overturn the conviction because there's no crime, and that's really stupid. So legislation is needed, and they helped with the legislation to make sure it worked. Fast forward just a few years, and that's an abomination. Now, the Jersey response was to have lots of reports. So there was the Clovier report, 2000, said that there shouldn't be the bailiff in the State Assembly. There's a legal opinion from Rabinder Singh, now Lord Justice Singh, who predicted that within 10 years the European Court of Human Rights' own case law would require change as a matter of necessity, as opposed to just looking at a particular case and deciding whether or not there was a problem there. Now, there's still no sign of that actually happening in any of the case law. So trying to predict the trend of cases within the European Court is a bit of a mug's game. The Carswell report in 2010 was strongly in favour of change. Basic reasons: political power requires separation, separation of powers issue. There is a possibility of Article 6 challenge. Does not require the bailiff's expertise. So a lot of time spent presiding could be spent as a judge. Now, the controversial decisions inevitable as speaker. Now, that's something that's kind of has shifted me to being a little bit more towards change, because if you are the speaker, you're going to have to make decisions as to whether somebody has overstepped the line. And I can think of two occasions. One was with Michael Burt when they were discussing gay marriage, and Nick the Corner, a particularly radical deputy at the time, denounced all the members who were opposed to it as being homophobic. Speaker steps in and says, no, that's not right. Speaker's inevitably expressing an opinion on that particular subject, because there is an opinion which says, well, if you disagree with this, then you are homophobic. Or so to actually express any sort of opinion there is to bring the speaker into an area of controversy, which is difficult if you are also meant to be a judge. Another one was when Deputy Tadier tried to ask a question playing on Ian Gorse being a Christian, saying, well, how do you reconcile this to your Christianity? And the bailiff stepped in and said that was completely out of order, and Deputy Tadier got suspended for a short period of time. Again, you're inevitably, there are lines between what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, which can be matters of controversy, political controversy, ethical controversy. And those are difficult things to involve somebody who is there because they are a judge. Even if you had a political presiding officer, if you had a John Bercow, they would be there because they were meant to be middle of the road, moderate, fairly attuned to the mood of the House as to what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable.
There's an undercurrent of discussion about whether the bailiff should remain as presiding officer. There's a handful of deputies that don't feel he should. I suspect that's more because, as I was saying earlier, deputy bailiffs' adherence to the rules of procedure that they think that they need to get meetings done. That's a suspect why. But it's having listened and spoken to Offie on, both sides of the fence and stuff firmly on the fence, which actually the question is, who do you put in instead? So is it that you elect the states are elected by suffrage, and then the states elect one of the 38 to be the speaker? Is that the thing? Yes, no, there's cause and against, or do you have a separate election process, but with a separate role for the speaker, so people put themselves forward, or do you advertise the role and have a appointment board to sit and look at it? It's actually I suspect in Guernsey that until they've identified who may be the presiding officer, the speaker, then that it won't become a live debate. And also again, so there is that provision that by using the acting presiding members, that the bailiff, the deputy bailiff, those crown appointees, those judges, the people, that are bound to be with the government can be taken off the equation. I think that's where the various differences are between the two islands.
Ordinary elects the president of the states, and in Gibraltar they appoint somebody, but they have a fairly good idea who they're going to appoint. There happened to be someone who'd not been a member of either main political party, who was well respected as a nice guy, and had briefly served as chief minister. So briefly, his nickname was El Breve. So they had somebody who was very much Johnny on the spot to do that role. It sounds like such a silly reason to not make a change, that there's a difficulty in deciding what replaces it. But of course, I think Australia has stayed a monarchy for 20 years solely on the basis that nobody can think of what to put in its place, or at least coalesce around a particular idea. Because it isn't necessarily the case that once you take away the people who are active in the states, and you really want people to be active, that you have somebody who's sufficiently august and respected to step into to that presiding role. And I imagine that if they did get rid of the bailiff as presiding officer in Jersey, the obvious candidate, other than the issues as to whether we'd want to do the job, would actually be one of the former bailiffs. Because you could end up with Sir Philip reappearing as an appointed presiding officer. Arguments in favour. Well, tradition. Oh, dear Dennis. Tradition is important. I mean, in any society, there is what they call a dignified aspect of government. If you want to run something that is theoretically perfect, then why do you even have a monarchy, for example? There's a standard of bailiff. There's no evidence of political influence. Legal skills, as we've been discussing, are useful for interpretation an application of standing orders. And in the end, if people are complaining that the standing orders are too strict, then whose standing orders are they in the first place? Would a respected speaker be found? So detract from the bailiff's role as civic head, although thinking that's probably more a Jersey issue than a Guernsey one. And in reality, there hasn't been any repetition of McDonald. And you've taken the necessary steps to prevent that. But despite my own wobbling on the issue, I quite like this quote from Lord Hoffman. Basically, if you want things to be done theoretically properly, then don't live in a community that's historic traditions and a built-up way of doing things. Go to somewhere which is founded on theoretical or religious principles. Now, I think I've taken you past 12 o'clock. I think we'll stop there.